a song for you.
You're listening to Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast. I will do one episode for each song the band recorded in the studio. However, this is a fan podcast and not band endorsed. It's more of a tribute to their long history, well beyond just the hits, and my way of giving something back to a band that has given so much to me. Let's dig in! Hello and welcome to Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast. I am your host, Scott Haskin, and I am very excited to be bringing you our very first review episode, the first of many, because that's pretty much what the show is all about. Not really review so much as it's going to be kind of just a deep dive into the song, what I hear, what I like, what's in the moment for me, and pretty much every one of these songs, except for the newer songs that I haven't had a chance to listen to that much, mainly the Equals One album, I know really well. So unlike the Uriah Heep podcast, I did the Magicians podcast, where there were some albums I had never even heard before and was very excited to dig into for the first time. Everything up until Equals One, I'm very, very familiar with. So we're going to get into those songs as we go on. We're going to go in chronological order per album and the way that they are presented on the album. And then any songs that were from those sessions but not included, bonus tracks like Painted Horse that never made it on to the album, we'll cover at the end of the official album tracks. So it's going to be really exciting. I'm so excited to start with this one because I love this song. This is called And the Address. It's the very first song on Shades of Deep Purple, but it has a bit of a quiet intro. So if you guys don't hear some audio right away, just hang in there for a few seconds. John Lord's wonderful Hammond organ will creep in slowly. So be patient and let's get this kicked off with it. Here we go. Okay, so imagine it's 1968 and you heard Hush on the radio and you're like, wow, this sounds really cool. I saw their album on the record store wall and I think I'll grab a copy. And you do, and you have really no idea what you're getting into because you probably only know one song. Maybe you've heard one of the other ones from the album, maybe Hey Joe or something. And so you really don't know what you're getting into. And this is heavy. This is, I mean, it's still heavy today, but this is really heavy for the day. And man, you really don't know what you're getting into. And hopefully you're pleasantly surprised by what you hear and you continue on with the song like we will now. I have to just stop it here because there's a couple really cool things going on. For one, you can tell that these are real musicians playing real instruments. And of course, in 1968, you would have expected nothing different. Anything else wouldn't have even crossed your mind. But in today's world where we're dealing with technology and, digital audio workstations, I'm not calling out Pro Tools specifically because you can do this in any of them, but where you take things and you shift everything so that it's all perfect and everybody lines up and it sounds incredibly inhuman. You heard in the beginning, they weren't 100% on with each other here. And I love that. I absolutely love it. Nowadays, all that would be corrected. The musicians would be gone from the studio. Someone would go back and shift everything into position. And, it would be just too perfect. And I love this human sounding product that we get. Also, just listening to the tones, I mean, the snare is a little bit on the tinny side, but it does have some bottom end to it. Bass drum sounds really flat. The guitar sound is crunchy for sure. It definitely has a good amount of distortion on it, but there's just something about the sound that really kind of goes, this is late 60s. You just hear it right away. The instruments sound good. The mix is good. I didn't talk about the album on the whole. The cover, there's two covers. One is just the single photograph of the band, and then the other one is multiple instances of the same picture, just in different tones of purple, obviously shades of Deep Purple, very literal. But the original version that I have on vinyl is on the Tetragrammaton label, the silver label, which is pretty cool. And it's in pretty good shape. I have to say, I'm really happy with it. It plays very nicely anyway. But every song on this album, with the exception of this one, I have to check as we go through the season, but I'm pretty sure everyone with the exception of this one has some sort of sound that starts everything. And we'll check that as we go on. If I remember, hopefully I'll remember. If not, remind me. I also want to let you guys know I'm recording these episodes about a month ahead of time before they air. That way, if something comes up, there's plenty of time to make sure that the schedule falls when it should, doing Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday shows. So if you comment on something I say, I'm probably not going to remember I said it, but if I've done something that's incorrect, for sure, let me know. But yeah, this song, it's really just got such an amazing sound to it. But the quality of the instruments is just so interesting. How the sound of them is. If you put those same instruments, the exact same ones in a room today, would sound completely different based just on the recording tools alone. And this album was recorded in 2 days, guys, 2 days. That's not much time, but they were very, very pressured by the record company to get this done. They're like, hurry up, we got to get this on the market. And I don't know how long the mixing took. According to Jon Lord, it was about 20 minutes. He said by the sound of it. But basically it's just a very quickly produced album. But I still say, even with that, considering the time, 1968, I think it still sounds good. And part of it, I have to say, and this is really going to go on with the whole podcast, there is a certain element of nostalgia that goes along with my feelings on these songs, as well as, I heard a lot of this stuff when I was pretty young. So I didn't really think about how well things were mixed, or, what stands up today, or how Richie's solo was, or this or that, where I'm looking at this with a more critical view now. So it's going to be interesting to fight that nostalgia versus just, blind acceptance of, this is what it was. And that's okay, because I think that's the truth of the matter. I could say, okay, this sound doesn't hold up in today's world, but you know what? In 1968, did it hold up? And that's all that really matters, because the music itself is timeless. Music doesn't change. The quality of the sound has changed, obviously, but whether or not the song holds up, it did in 1968. And that's all that matters. So we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to worry about what's fun and interesting in the song, what works, what doesn't work, and just take it for what it was, because that's what the show really is all about. So let's get back to the song and hear where it goes from here. It almost feels like a bit of a call and response, though it's really just repeated. I mean, you've got Jon Lord during one section just hitting a couple of chords on the organ. Then you've got Richie coming in with his response. And in the meanwhile, we've got just Nick Simper holding up the bass, and we've got Ian Pace on the drums. And also this really just, I love the pitch of this cowbell for this song. Normally that would be a little bit high pitched, a little bit tinny for me, but I actually really like it for this song. And again, could be just because I'm so used to it, because, hey, this is the song we're given. So, you wouldn't think about switching out instruments or going, well, if they used a lower cowbell, it would have been better or anything like that. This was the song. So I do love the sound of it. I was a little bit disappointed, and we'll get to this when we get to the newer stuff. But on the album Whoosh, the band re-recorded this thinking that it very well could be their last album. So they put the last song on the album as a remake of And the Address. And we'll get to that song, but I was disappointed that the cowbell was not as prominent. It almost doesn't sound like a cowbell. It sounds something a little bit brighter, a little bit higher pitched than most cowbells, but I don't know what kind of cowbells they had available in 68. So could have been all kinds of pitches for all I know. But anyway, that's where we are. Let's get back to the song because we're about to hit what would be, I guess, the chorus. You know, if you go with the call and response theme, it's almost like Richie saying, stop asking me that question. Really cool. I love that passage. I just love the feel of it. It feels a little bit optimistic with Richie going up into a little bit of higher notes and just hanging on to that first note a little bit. I've always enjoyed that. It always feels a little bit triumphant, a little bit, I'm going to be okay. And that's just what the music says to me. What it says to you may be completely different. It might say nothing at all. It might just be music that you enjoy. But I've always liked that. Of course, the cowbell continues. And obviously, this was recorded on, a separate track after the fact. I would imagine this was probably recorded, probably 8-track, I would think. But anyway, I love the sound of it. And the cowbell's really cool because it does continue all the way through. It works sort of as a metronome, and metronomes weren't used in music at this point. So at least not in rock music in studios. I don't think they were probably used for like classical musicians maybe. But in any case, yeah, it's really cool. And it's kind of a little bit dominant in this mix, though, I have to say. If it would have been a little subtler, that would be a bit nicer as an engineer. But yeah, it really flows nicely. I recently heard a quote from Richie talking about this era of the band, the Mark I era, and just how he wasn't sure what he wanted to be as a musician. I mean, he'd been doing a lot of session work, and when you're doing session work, there's some element of your personality that comes out, but a lot of times you're just playing what you're told to play. And so this was an opportunity for him to really decide who he wanted to be as a guitarist. And I think in this solo, I think that you do see a bit of the guitarist he would go on to be. And I feel a lot of that here. And I love this solo. I think it's fantastic. But again, this is, kind of one of those things where this is what he played. And so this is what we have to enjoy. And I definitely do enjoy it. Also notice all of a sudden there's a huge amount of reverb on the guitar, which wasn't as noticeable before. Of course, we weren't hearing these pitches before, but yeah, it's just like all of a sudden they're in a large cavern. And that's kind of cool. But anyway, yeah, I love that solo. Okay, so I just noticed something that in the bazillion times I've heard this song, I've never noticed before. And it could be that I'm just paying a little bit more attention critically, or it could just be, something in the headphones that gives me an EQ that's allowing me to hear this. But there's actually 2 cowbells going on, or a cowbell and something else. And I think I figured out what it is. So there's a very low tone cowbell, the kind of cowbell that you would expect to hear. And then there's this higher, like tink, tink, tink sound over it, which I've been calling the cowbell for years. I don't think that's a cowbell. I think it's a muted cymbal. Like it could be the bell of the hi-hat or the bell of the ride with the cymbal being held onto so it doesn't ring out. and they just let the studio reverb handle that instead of the room, because it changes the way that it performs. If the whole cymbal's ringing out, then the sound of it's going to be completely different. So I think very possibly that's what we actually have here. I think we have two things. It's the actual cowbell is very low in the mix. It's just thickening up that bell sound a little bit, but I think that's what it is. I think it's a bell. I think it's either the hi-hat or a ride, maybe a crash cymbal. He didn't have a lot of cymbals. He would have had, I think, two crashes or just one crash and a crash ride and then the hi-hat. So not a lot to choose from, but it could have been any of those. It could have been something that was sitting in the studio. Who knows? But yeah, I never noticed that before. Very, very interesting. I like that they did that. This is the first of many Ritchie and John trade-off solos that we will go over throughout Deep Purple's recording career. Again, like this is just such an energetic solo from John. And, Ian Paice is doing a lot of energetic fills. You really feel a lot of youth in this song. I think, just I'm excited to play. I want to stand out. I want to do my part. I want to support the song, but I also want to be present as an individual. And yeah, really, really cool stuff. And I just enjoy it fully. It's a great solo from John. This is really, if it's 1968 and you're listening to this album for the first time, you're just learning who these guys are, because they did a lot of work, but it was, very centralized. Ritchie was probably fairly anonymous as a studio musician to the general public. And he was known in the music studios and among those circles as a virtuoso. But I would imagine publicly, like most people didn't know who was playing on what back then. They only knew, who the band was or maybe who the singer was, and John was playing locally. Ian Paice was playing locally. Like they weren't touring the world, and they really just weren't that well known. So this is really the first taste that people in the public eye are getting of this band, and I'd be pretty pleased. One thing I haven't really talked about yet is Nick Simper, because his bass is a little bit buried in there, but you can hear it. He's actually playing the rhythm, but then part almost of a counter rhythm where he's playing in between on the eighths instead of on the quarter notes. And it just switches back for a couple of notes. And I really like that. It really gives the song a pretty amazing groove that would have just been fairly straightforward. So he's accenting what John's doing and playing the straight rhythm at the same time. It's pretty cool. Great slowing down effect there with that concert ending. Really powerful, great way to open a new album. And it's interesting because I think it's one of the heaviest songs on the album. So it's kind of setting a somewhat false expectation for what would come throughout the rest of the album, but definitely a fantastic heavy song. And God, I can't even imagine in 1968 what it would be like to hear that for the first time and go, wow, what's happening with this band? Who are these guys coming out of nowhere? Not Driving Like Rain, because that would come later. Although they did have a Rainy Day song in this album, so there is that. But before we wrap up this episode, I wanted to play you a short clip from a Jon Lord interview. This one comes from the 1968 to 1976 radio special, and here's a little bit of Jon Lord.
Richie had heard Ian Pace play in Hamburg, and he contacted him. The guy, it was amazing. It was like a fairy tale for me at the time. You know, he hired a farmhouse just outside London and put us in there and said, right, you know, hold auditions for singers and bass players, and it was amazing, you know, to find that kind of help. So we went into we were put into a recording studio and told to make an album. We were given 24 hours. That's how it was in those days. It was so we did everything we'd been rehearsing, made an album out of it. We did it in 24 hours. The mixing took, well, if you listen back to Shades of Deep Purple, which was the album, it took about 9 minutes, I think. So and we weren't allowed to even touch it, you know. And on that album was our version of the Joe South song called Hush.
Okay, so you see how good my memory is. I said 2 days and 20 minutes. So there you go. So, of course, we'll get to Hush tomorrow. That is the second song on Shades of Deep Purple. And a little precursor, there's actually going to be 2 versions of it that I'm going to be covering. And the reason is that the second version is a studio recording that came on a live album called Nobody's Perfect. And so since it's kind of fragmented and not part of any studio album, I didn't really have a place to put it that would have made sense. So I'm going to go ahead and include it in tomorrow's episode that I'm doing with a very special guest, my first guest on the podcast, guys. Very excited. I hope you've enjoyed And the Address, the very first listenable Deep Purple song on a Deep Purple album from Shades of Deep Purple, 1968. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Cheers. Thanks for listening to Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast, a tour of the entire Deep Purple studio recordings. Please remember to give the show a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Leave a comment and tell your friends. I also have a Patreon set up if you'd like to support the show. You can also write to me at smokeonthepodcast@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thanks for listening.